Welcome to another episode of the CAPISAR podcast. I'm here with astrologer Mark Jones to talk about the therapeutic applications in astrology. Thanks, Mark, for joining. It's a great pleasure having you on.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks. So, the purpose of this episode is obviously to talk about the therapeutic applications of astrology, and one of the reasons why I wanted to do this episode is because even before the podcast was launched, this is still a very new podcast, and even before this was launched, I got your book and I started reading it. And I should tell that I have a very traditional background, and also I come from India. So my foundations is Jyotish or Indian astrology. And before 7 or 8 years, I got introduced to traditional Hellenistic and Persian astrology. And I have kind of on and off studied some modern works, including Stephen Forrest, and now I'm introduced to your works. And so, and your book, that is The Soul Speaks, which pretty much talks about the therapy or therapeutic nature of astrology, kind of moved me to a greater extent. So, and this was one of the very earliest episodes that I planned. So we are doing it, and so I wanted to understand portions of the book from you. Obviously, it's not possible to kind of talk about this entire book. There's a lot of gems that's hidden, and I'm trying to kind of take some information and see how it reaches the audience. So, what is therapeutic astrology according to you, or what is the nature of therapeutic application in astrology?
Well, we're making a distinction, right? So I appreciate your interest, and I appreciate your appreciation of the book. The Soul Speaks was, so I've written 3 books. The first, Healing the Soul, was a method involving the lunar nodes and a way of looking at using the outer planets as a kind of transpersonal or deeper imagination or psychic content within people to help steer the lunar nodes from a Western point of view in a kind of evolutionary perspective, if you like. And then I paused and I wrote The Soul Speaks because, frankly, the best of astrology is deep, isn't it? It's deep work. And when you talk to people about deep work, they occasionally go deep. And when they go deep, that's amazing on the one hand. And on the other hand, you've got a problem or a challenge. What's going on here when we talk about someone's chart? It might genuinely change the course of their life. Have we thought about that enough? We read endless astrology books. We go to conferences and we hear lectures on technique and the history and ways of determining this or that in a chart. There's hardly any focus on what's happening to the people we talk to about it.
Yeah.
And this is incredibly like a missing piece for me. And then I would go as far at this point to say we want to be thinking about astrology in a multiplicity of ways. So we want to be acknowledging that there are research astrologers, people that translate ancient texts, that do technical, historical work of great value to the community, that there are technical type astrologers, literally using data sets to hopefully improve the efficacy of techniques. And then there are consulting astrologers, of which I would be one, right? Our prime directive is to help people using their natal chart. This is a whole other category, isn't it? And immediately you're effectively, Aswin, in that place of, like you and I right now, 2 people in a room, a virtual room, Google Meet, Zoom, whatever it is, or an office somewhere in the world. What is the one area of study that has studied 2 people in a room and all their dynamics? Therapy. That's the 20th century psychology made its expertise studying the dynamics of the helpful interface, or the hopefully helpful interface. I mean, it's questionable if a lot of therapy actually did help people.
Yeah.
But it's so I had to think about those things. Why? Because I'd been out there in the world enough that people were contacting me from all over the world. I was speaking to people. I still have a busy practice. I'm still speaking to 16, 18, 20, 22 people a week around the world using these techniques. So, to what extent are we responsible for how well that goes? What do we have to think about when we do that? What are the obvious obstacles?
Yeah.
That's the start of it. Yeah.
Yeah. No, thanks. I think you kind of gave a nice pathway into what we're actually going to discuss. So you spoke about different ways of doing it, like consulting and so whatever it is. But very early in the book, you talk about Carl Jung. So you quote Carl Jung where he says that, uh, like, show me a sane man and I'll cure him. So it doesn't really kind of mean that only truly affected people who are damaged psychologically, or in a very debilitated state of mind should kind of approach therapy or therapeutic astrology. But sometimes there are things that doesn't necessarily come out explicitly, but still there's something that we might find, and which may or may not be possible uncovering with the help of linear or conventional therapy. But astrology can be very different because of its very nature of uncovering deeper things by looking at the planetary patterns. And you also
Well, you
mentioned that,
raised, well, let me highlight before I forget. You
yeah,
make two brilliant points there, right? One, you're pointing towards a distinction early on in what you just said between a kind of conventional patching people up kind of therapy, bandaging their wounds, getting them back to work, getting them back to their family kind of therapy, and the idea of individuation in Jung, the idea that life is this huge learning or, potential expansion of your being and understanding, and that's a more complex path. So you could say there are two types of therapy, couldn't you? The healing the wounded kind of therapy and getting them back to their life, and the encouraging people to their full potential kind of therapy, the individuation path, which you're hinting at. And astrology could be potentially useful in both applications, but it's especially useful in the encouraging people to their full potential. Because do we not have, on the one hand, is the natal chart not, the best personality tool or typology that exists in psychology? It's better than the Myers-Briggs. It's, no disrespect to the Enneagram, which is a very useful tool. It's much more nuanced. There's many more dimensions to it than the Enneagram. It's much more particular, the degree of techniques and potential meanings that can be extrapolated. So as you're pointing out, astrology could be enormously useful in the therapeutic path. And that's one of the points of The Soul Speaks. I'm not just saying astrology could learn something from psychology and learn something about how to get the message across or what's really going on when two people talk in a room. I'm also saying, goodness me, what could psychology get from astrology? Why aren't more therapists using this incredible map in a way? Oh, you've gone quiet. I don't know if you're muted accidentally.
yeah. So again, you raised or made a very interesting point by saying that what can psychology learn from astrology, and again, one of the things that you mentioned in your book, which I also agree with, is what is the real plan or an actual method of the conventional medical science to address all these psychological issues or people, those who need therapy. And you point out that antidepressant medications are really kind of a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it just kind of ends up in a place where people take antidepressant medications and they kind of subsidize or neutralize their pain for a temporary period of time, and we never know when that particular person will go back to being their old self or being their debilitated self from a psychological perspective. But and also one of those things is in so many Commonwealth nations and also other developed countries where medicine is basically difficult to access because of various reasons. And you also mentioned that in UK it could take sometimes 2 years in worst case for those people who need therapy, and that could be really taxing and also traumatic in many cases. So
I've
but
worked with
this is where,
people. I've known people where the person killed themselves in the wait. Yeah,
yeah, I just
known
didn't want
that
to mention that.
situation. Yeah. It's that hardcore if you delay the crisis response. Yeah, but please carry on.
But my point here is that, and this is where astrology really helps, because you can just book a session with a therapeutic astrologer, and you can just, I mean, who has a psychology or psychotherapy background as well, and you can kind of immediately start at least knowing your issues. Addressing is a different point. Maybe there, I mean, few more sessions of counseling or consultations might be needed, but at least the first session itself will quickly give the pathway to where that particular person has to go. And one of the difficulties with conventional medicine is that the underlying cause of whatever the person is going through may just kind of be there. It probably will never go. But with astrology, from a therapeutic or counseling perspective, it's a completely different ballgame and can be extremely advantageous. So
Well,
this is
that's a
what I
very,
wanted you to elaborate.
yeah,
on.
well, that's a very good point. But again, you raise a number of complex issues. So just let's return to psychopharmacological intervention, medication, etc., the clinical world. It's clear, isn't it, that in the materialism, the sort of rationalistic materialism of scientific thinking and increasing academic specialization, that the Diagnostic Statistician's Manual in America keeps coming out with more and more specific issues, right? So instead of there, 30, 40 years ago, there's like a couple of hundred. Now there's 600. And when the new edition comes out at the end of the decade, maybe there's 1,000. And then pharmacological companies can leap on that and say, oh, this treatment that didn't work for XYZ thing might work for this. We have to see the potential for commercial cynicism to enter the picture, right? This is not to say that some people don't benefit from pharmacological intervention. Clearly they do. A percentage of people do. But it's all too easy for busy doctors to just hand out pills like candy to get depressed, upset people away from their waiting room when they've got so many people lined up. Right? We have to also understand that they don't have the resources to refer people. Then when they do refer people, there might be an extraordinary wait. Even the models of counseling used might be very specific. They might not address the deeper patterns. Who's to say a chunk of people upset and anxious in the contemporary world are not sick on a psychic or soul level? Then they're sick with the lack of deeper meaning associated with their symptoms. And even then you could say, if you just medicate them, are you not robbing them of the opportunity through the suffering to understand something of their deeper self? So I agree with you. So it points this incredible way. Well, so let's look at the current world, the rise of YouTube, podcasts, the space you and I are in today, having this really, it's just started out, but rather wonderful conversation, not really knowing each other beforehand. Mainly through the dedication that you've put into thinking about the points I raised. This is the new world, isn't it? This is the new media, and in this world, coaching, life hacks, the right vitamin portfolio to take, the right way to exercise, the right way to do this, this is the new terrain, and it has enormous potential. It has enormous potential to be, superstitious mumbo jumbo and snake oil salesman, but it also has enormous potential to genuinely help people. And in that new era, these new forms like astrology, like different forms of coaching, like different models, are really there to help people. Standard psychotherapy in the deeper sense, think of years of therapy, maybe several times a week at hundreds of dollars a time. This is simply off the plate for most people in the world, isn't it? So we need to see this democratization of the insights. We need to share the insights more. But then it becomes a challenge to astrology, I would argue, because astrologers have to step up to be that figure that you described that might help people. They need greater expertise. They need psychological training. They need to even see the astrology differently. That's another part of the complexity here, because I am offering, quite a radical perspective in some ways on that.
I think it might sound radical in some ways, but I think it is very conventional if we look at it from a therapeutic perspective. And coming to helping people, you mentioned that helping people where astrologers need to step up their game and try to understand portions of psychology and probably even psychotherapy, which supports in healing. And that's not every astrologer can do. That's one thing. So it's an immediate boundary that we need to draw there. It's not everyone's cup of tea. So before we get into how we actually approach a session and how we give that space to a client to open up, I want to ask you one thing, like how important is psychotherapy background or psychology background for those who are really involved in healing? Because what I believe is that at in some sense, as astrologers, we are counselors. That's undeniable.
Yes.
Regardless of what form of astrology we do,
Well,
somewhere down
brilliant.
the line,
I'm glad you
we have to
agree.
do counseling.
As
Yeah.
soon as you set yourself up as an advice, a figure of advice or a mentor in the moment to a person or a guide, you have created a de facto counseling coaching arrangement. Yes. You are
Yeah.
in the guidance trade. Yeah.
So how important it is to
Well,
know
so
psychotherapy work?
that's a great question. It's complex, but I'll give the short version of the complex answer. Clearly, it's
Just a minute, Mark. Sorry to interrupt,
yes,
but I also want you to kind of talk about this your background in healing and psychotherapy,
yes.
and how you integrate it in your practice and how it might actually help other astrologers.
Well, let me start there, and then I'll try and make the general point.
Yeah.
So, I was studying spiritual teachings in my early 20s, and part of that led me to a Kabbalistic study group led by Zeb Ben Shimon Halevi, or Warren Kenton, as he was called as an astrologer, and it was a weekend on Kabbalistic astrology. And so in my early 20s, early mid-20s, I get into astrology. That leads me into various psychological terrain, Jungian thought, the different psychological astrologies. And I train as a therapist in my late 20s. So I'm an astrologer first, but an astrologer that's gotten into astrology because of psychological and spiritual reasons. And then the fortunate thing I have is, so I'm teaching astrology classes right early on in a holistic health center, having just met the secretary of the center gets talking to me one day and just invites me to teach a class, saying there's a whole group of people who've been waiting for an astrologer to come along, and here I am, kind of thing. At the same time, I also develop a psychotherapy practice in a city in Bristol in the UK in the 2000s, entirely independently. So I have this rare experience of being entirely independently a psychotherapist and an astrologer, and then have had the time to blend the two over the years. Right? I mean, the subtleties of that I could go into, but let's just say it's unusual to be both entirely separately and then bring them together. And it's given me a lot of insight about the distinctions. Now, a small percentage of people who are out and out psychotherapists and astrologers, sure, or people that are out and out psychotherapists that don't become astrologers, but just learn enough astrology to be able to see some of the patterns for their clients. That would be amazing, right? But what I'm doing, I'm not saying you have to be a psychotherapist or even a trained counselor. In fact, if you're in a country like America, for example, the clinical restrictions on that would be so great that they would probably make you put the astrology away. So since COVID, really, my response to COVID was to create a 2-year spiritual psychology coaching training. And I've been trying to think about very intensely what are the models that people need to have in order to be therapeutically effective. So you're not aiming to become a therapist. You're just aiming to have learned some of the therapeutic insights that have come from therapists, so that you can apply them in a slightly different, shorter term kind of way with less ongoing support. And this would be part of the democratization of the therapy process, but it would also be a way of allying the natal chart with more short-term coaching models or mid-term coaching, encouraging people to achieve the transformational potential that the chart reading identified.
Yeah.
Or the Pluto transit, or the Saturn transit. It's your Saturn return. Oh my gosh, have you understood your Saturn return? And you get the support during that 18-month period or whatever it is.
Yeah. So and these planetary cycles help us in understanding the dynamics and nature of how a person is going through a developmental phase, or kind of parts of their developmental stages in their life, and which could also kind of reflect their current mindset or mental apparatus.
Yes.
And all these information, like you mentioned, is going to kind of act as a a complementary aspect to the counseling skills for astrologers. So and then going back, like I want to ask, like sitting in a client setup, and we never know what the client is going through, and we just have to look at the chart. And some clients give us information about what they're going through, and some clients don't. But looking at the chart, we have some kind of an idea as to why they are booking a session and what they need. But the problem with most people is that trust. Like
Yes.
if someone is coming, so, and that is another thing that you mentioned very early, the importance of trust, and trying to build a trust in that the unified space that we have between the astrologer and the client is very, very important for an astrologer to kind of uncover what is going on in a
Yes.
client's life, and also for the client to open up, which is the paramount. So how do we kind of prepare ourselves in a client session where we build trust and also enable the person to open up uh, why they're actually there? Because some people realize they need help, but they just end up not saying that at all.
Well, that is a brilliant question. And you, sir, have thought about the implications of my book. Yeah, I respect that. This is, we could spend our whole time talking just about this, right? Because it's so layered, but I will attempt to be clear on different levels. I mean, some observations. One, I always start by saying, how can I help you today? I check the chart data and I say, how can I help you? So immediately I'm positioning myself in a service role, but I'm also making it clear that they have to speak. They have to articulate what they're here for. Even if they say something like, I want you to read my chart, I'll go, yeah, of course, I have it right here. Why today? What's going on? Because and then if they're still stuck, I'll say something like this. Look, we're trusting me to have the insights about your natal chart, which is a symbolic picture. And that symbolic picture is going to come alive if we manage to translate it to your individual life circumstance. That's when the symbolism is really going to come alive, if we can relate it to your life. So let's look into that, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So I'm positioning it as a relational process right from the beginning. Now, obviously, that's different from some astrologers. Every now and then someone freaks out about that. One of the last people that freaked out about that was actually a therapist themselves. So, therapists can be incredibly defensive.
Defense
Yeah.
systems. My next
Yes.
question is,
Yes. Yeah, we'll come to that. Okay. So
Yeah.
then the trust thing. This is a very profound thing, right? So there's a series of things I'd like people to think about in a way. I mean, one, it's just an observation. If some people don't trust anyone, life has hurt them, maybe early childhood stuff, maybe the loss of someone, you're not going to overcome that. The best you can do with some people is get close to it. Some people are not just going to open up and trust you in some full way. So you have to skirt around that because you can't just push them aside, as it were. And then the other thing I would say is, and if I may make an almost, if you like, psychic or spiritual point, there is an initiatory aspect here. You have to ask yourself, if you want to work helping people, you have to ask yourself, why, how ready are you? How many things have you examined in your own life? How much work have you done here? How honest are you prepared to be with people about the stuff you do understand and the stuff you don't? Because you need to know what you don't know in a weird kind of way. Not know it fully, but you need to know it's a gap. So when a client asks me about some things, like how to resolve a certain kind of thing, and I've resolved it in my life, I'll be like, hey, that's really resolvable. And then let's say, some young man is talking about the complexities of sexuality, or, someone's talking about the demands of the spiritual path. I'll go, hey, man, that's a really tough area. It's not like I've resolved all of it. It's not like I understand every one of these mysteries, but let's look at it together. It's important where you're coming from, that it's authentic, right? So there's this key part of trust that's about authenticity. And to be authentic in those situations, you need to know, in a sense, what you don't know as well as what you do. But then on a deeper level too, how can I put this? I don't want to sound, but because I was a psychotherapist for 15 years, and since I dropped my license 8-9 years ago, I've still continued to do that work in a different form, just not the licensed version, because I'm not working with people from my own country most of the time.
Yeah.
I have been with people, right, on the edge. I've been with people on the edge of the darkness. I've been with people on the edge of the chasm. That is something that's not going to get through to everyone, but some people will appreciate that, or they will read a book, or they'll have heard me speak, or they'll realize when they're speaking to me, even if they haven't done those things, there's an opportunity. And it's a gamble, isn't it? It won't always work.
Yeah.
There are people who are disappointed in me. There are people who are upset with me, who didn't feel it worked. It's not perfect. No one can do this 100%. You're taking a risk. Trust is always a risk, a gamble, just like having a girlfriend or boyfriend is a risk or gamble. They might disappoint you. They might betray you.
Yeah.
There's always a risk. But at the same time, there are people who are more ready to take the risk, who therefore give off a certain authority or quality within them because they have put themselves on the line for people. And we have to decide, are we that kind of person?
So, which takes us to defense. So
yes.
I think defense is a very interesting subject, which is very relevant from both astrologers and also from clients' perspective. So there are situations like, for example, if you're dealing with the, NPD client or someone like that, or someone with the tendencies like narcissistic personality.
Yes.
It immediately becomes very difficult for us to kind of go through their shield. So they have this shield and they don't want anyone else to kind of go through it. It's not necessarily a judgmental thing, but that is the tendency of a narcissistic personality disorder or something like that. So in that case, how do we break that defense and go, and how do we also maintain our own defense?
In that case, you don't. And if this is a clinical phenomenon, so the kind of counseling skills we're talking about people learning would not have to be total, that you're not training to be a therapist, so you don't have to understand everything about narcissism or borderline or uni or bipolar. You just don't, and you just don't want to work with it. Not in its clinical form. You need to know it enough to identify it. Clinical narcissism, in that sense, someone who is creating a grandiose and defensive personal story, which they absorb into and a self-obsession around, is essentially defensive. Somewhere there is a bomb site in their personality, and they are creating a sideshow so that you never get to the bomb site. That is work that's too deep. That's too deep for many counselors. Many therapists fall short there, and it's not even necessarily their fault if the person's clinically divided to such an extreme extent. Astrologers, even psychologically orientated astrologers, don't want to be getting into that, frankly. And often it wouldn't even emerge in a single session anyway. It would emerge if the astrologer does follow-up work, because what I am proposing is a sort of model where people who are inclined to it do short-term models of coaching or counseling as follow-up, and that's when that kind of thing is more likely to emerge. Contrary to popular belief, where narcissism gets placed on Hollywood personalities or politicians or whatever, narcissism in its true sense doesn't really emerge straight away necessarily, because you wouldn't have any reason to suspect that their story about what they were doing was suspect. You just probably take them sincerely to begin with, and that's appropriate.
Yeah.
So certain defensive structures can only emerge over time, because just because a person's in a defensive structure does not mean that you should not treat them as an adult. So there's so many paradoxes in the therapeutic work. The paradox of knowing that your client is acting out like a child in an infantile way, or throwing their toys or whatever. And yet the paradox at the same time of treating them like an adult, because that's a respectful thing to do. When adults communicate with you, you have to take what they say seriously. There are some impossible dilemmas for therapists in a way. That's why there's such a lot of long specialized training some of the time. This is not something you want to get into, this level of defensiveness. But the level of defensiveness is something like this. I come for a reading with you. You're like, oh, hi, how can I help? Whatever. And I'm like, well, your astrology lecture really brought up a lot of stuff for me. And you're like, oh, it was funny stuff it brought up. It suddenly becomes clear that, every time they touch anything painful or they were stirred up, they just start laughing like a hyena or something, clearly, or smiling, those people that just smile to the point. A lady came to me for a reading in a conference once and said she smiled so much her face was aching that day, because that's her response to the interpersonal tension of being around people or hearing difficult information in the lectures. So she puts on a false, brave face. Now, this kind of defensiveness is very important, isn't it? Because there is a danger the entire reading could just be you speaking and her continuing to smile in that face-speaking kind of way, like a rigor mortis kind of smile. And I would argue that would probably mean the whole reading was not very consequential, did not hit home or kind of reach her in some more fundamental way. So I think, there are defensive structures that need analysis, but once you get to the clinical personality disorders, it should be left alone for therapists. And frankly, even therapists struggle.
Okay. So the reason why I asked is because as astrologers, we need to know what we can do and what we won't be able to do. So,
yes.
Yeah.
Now by the way, that is a subject for a talk entirely on itself. Imagine a brainstorming. Fundamentally, what can astrology do and what can't it do? There are enormous psychological, emotional, mental, philosophical concepts one would have to deal with. And I'm happy to have that conversation maybe another time with you, but that is an important question in itself.
Okay.
We are not just directly disseminating the wisdom of the stars. Let's just be clear here. We are not like, figures from the Vedas or Old Testament prophets or something. We're just not. That's not what, and the danger is that that's what people project.
Right. I think this is a different philosophical debate and a topic of discussion, as you mentioned. But you said something about people putting up a false face and trying to kind of hide or pose a shield so that the person that they're talking to doesn't get to that level that they don't want the astrologer to get to. And this directly links to some kind of one particular trauma or series of traumatic incidents that took place in their life that created a hole or a black dot. And these have different levels of impact in their developmental stages as a human being. And in order to understand these developmental stages, we need planets and their positions. And you talk about the role of the nodes of the moon in the chart. So what is the my idea is just to kind of have you introduce how we kind of understand the past dynamics with the the moon's nodes and see how they can actually come out of that and try to heal the past as much as possible, and maybe just not give as much scope for antidepressants.
Brilliant question. See, I think before you get to the moon's nodes, you have to understand the moon. And it's important to remember the moon's nodes are created by the orbital motion of the moon, and they're created together. By the way, in parenthesis, you would have to say, therefore, they can't be separated. You can't separate the south node and just say that's just the past, or that's just what was wrong, or that's just what, you can't do that because they're created together. They're a parabola of motion. They're describing an evolutionary arc, right? But they're describing the evolutionary arc of the moon. What is the moon? Look at the first four archetypes: Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer. Cancer, the moon. Developmentally, I would argue Aries birth, the ascendant birth from the 12th, from the wherever we came from, as it were. The impulse for life, Aries, blind, instinctive life. Taurus, the development of needs, survival concerns, the child's safety in development. Gemini, the early mental life, the ability to label and contextualize language and communicate with the parents. And the kind of bringing together of all of that in the holding environment. Cancer is the personal self. So the moon, with its changing faces, effectively is a symbol of the developmental self. And that's why the moon's nodes are so powerful, because they are the evolutionary arc of momentum of the developmental self, of the most personal human self, the you that was born in a particular family, in a particular neighborhood, in a particular country. So the moon's nodes become both an access into the pre-verbal dimensions of early childhood, the sort of history of the moon. And then, as I hint at strongly in my first book, I may even say it gently, explicitly. If I'd been a better writer when I was younger, I'd have said it more explicitly and thought about it more, which is in Healing the Soul, I strongly hint that effectively the intuition that was coming from my psychotherapy work in my 30s. So this is sort of 20 years ago, or no, Healing the Soul came out in 2011, so 15 years ago, or whatever, 14 years ago. But the thinking that led up to it was happening in the 3 to 5 years beforehand. Was effectively early childhood, the atmosphere in which you grow up, the context culturally, in terms of religion, in terms of the emotional dynamics of your parents, the systemic river system that you're born into, shapes you so profoundly. It's as if it's a condensation of what we could call karma. You know, it is the example of an early environment that shapes you profoundly for the rest of your life, but you had no control over it. You didn't make the choices. They are pre-existing to you. Hence, it becomes a way that, if you like, in quotes, karma manifests in the world through you. So the link from the lunar nodes to karma, to, you know, the past story and your evolving intentions, and the link to the pre-verbal aspects of the moon, the developmental self, tie in together, because the pre-verbal atmospheres of your early life that shaped you so much are the way that karma condensed for you in this life. So it's creating a level of meaning and purpose, isn't it, to the whole origin story. And the brilliant thing about astrology is that it can validate the sense of the meaning in people's lives, even the meaning of struggle.
And one of the most important things that you mention is the natural zodiac and,
Yes.
12 steps towards the healing
Yes.
process, which
Yes.
you touched upon now, obviously.
Yes.
So can we just go a little deeper into that and see how the potential to transform human lives kind of walks through the signs of the zodiac?
Yes.
And obviously, I think it's important for us to kind of bring the dynamics not just of the nodes, but also of the outer planets, which
Yes.
you talk about very deeply. So can we touch upon the outer planets a little bit and then circle back to the planetary cycles?
Well, you realize, don't you, that astrology is a series of circles within circles, if you like. It's a series of embedded, you know, like the supersaturated solution from which a crystal emerges. It has lattices in it. It has meanings embedded within meanings. Because on one level, Aries to Pisces is the story of your life, like a river system. So, you know, you're born as a little spring in the mountains, as it were, the little impulse of life, Aries, and then you flow along, and, you know, you develop a sense of personal self in your home at Cancer. You start your first creativity at Leo. You have your first crisis at Virgo. You know, am I any good? What am I doing here? What's the meaning of relationships, Libra? And you go into the relationship cycle. And you could plan all of that with the Saturn cycle. So you could say at the first Saturn square, personal self forms, Cancer, Moon, 4th house. At pubescence, Saturn opposition, 13 or 14, you have the Libra lesson. Suddenly, you know, you thought girls were silly before, suddenly you're obsessed about girls, or whatever, you know. And then at 21, you're asked, what should I do with my life? Saturn's gone to the, as it were, midheaven, or the Capricorn.
The second Saturn square.
Yeah. So, and that's the first Uranus square too. Hence, it's of marked importance when the cycles cross over, because it indicates even more power. So you've got the second Saturn square going, how do I understand myself? How have I grown up? But you've got the first Uranus square. How do I fit in? What's my creative option here? How distinct can I be? Or am I going to lose myself in this process? So there's all that way of looking at it, in which sense, you know, Capricorn becomes your achievements in the world, but you don't have to do it on that timescale either. You could say these are phases of life, as the work of A.T. Mann used to show, the lifetime astrology. You know, you're talking about age periods in your life, if you like. Or you could say more generally, Capricorn is just the sense of how much you achieved. What would your professional reputation be, etc. Now, it's interesting when you get to that upper part, that's where the outer planets are, isn't it? So there's this other level with the outer planets where you have to, if you accept them, if you accept modern astrology's breakthrough, and I think it's a very interesting thing to contemplate, you realize there's a different layer added by the outer planets being there to their traditional rulers. Just like, you know, I read a book recently, Destroyer of Worlds, on the history of nuclear science. And quite consciously, plutonium atomic weight 93, and neptunium, atomic weight 94, following uranium, the highest stable element, 92, were named consciously out of the outer planets. This Eastern European linguistic expert who loved cryptic crossword puzzles picked out deliberately to keep the Uranus, Pluto, Neptune thing. They actually picked it out in nuclear science in the 30s. They actually named the elements following uranium that only come into being when uranium is agitated. They consciously named them after the outer planets. And there is this kind of almost like discovering radioactivity, isn't it? When you go from the world of Saturn, Saturn's like Newtonian physics. You know, it's like the clockwork universe. You can measure the boundaries, the machinery of the universe. And Uranus, Pluto, Neptune are more like radioactive quantum phenomena. They are, I would say, the most useful way to contemplate the outer planets from an interesting perspective is to see them as nonlinear. That Saturn is the end of the linear. It's the boundary of the linear. It's not like the traditional astrologers were wrong or anything. Saturn is a fundamental boundary. It's just that the outer planets symbolize nonlinear processes.
Yeah. In many ways, the way we approach this entire therapeutic healing or astrology is kind of an organic and a non-linear process as opposed to the linear scientific regimen or something like that. And which is why astrology is probably a little more successful from a therapeutic perspective than the scientific perspective itself, because
of course. Well, because it's not a science. Let's just be frank with each other, right?
Yeah.
Astrology is not a science. It's not like civil engineering. Too many people think astrology is like, if I learn this technique, I will be able to determine if the bridge, has a load-bearing weight. I can tell you this bridge can take 200 trucks each day or whatever, and I can be accurate as a civil engineer or something, or STEM subjects, But astrology is nothing like that. It's much more of an art. And this is why prediction is so problematic. Prediction, let's just be brutally frank, right? We're long enough into the conversation that any casual listeners have probably left already anyway. Astrology is frequently wrong in its predictions, just like, really wrong a lot, because, as many interesting people have pointed out, prediction is a very difficult game. And one wit said, particularly predicting the future. Weather apps, we have the best, climate science going on. It's the great obsession of the age, isn't it? Climate science. And so weather apps have improved. But, in a place like Britain with a complex weather, they're still only accurate to 3 to 5 days. And even then they might change the day before, because it's a nonlinear system. It's a chaotic nonlinear system, the weather. There are simple variables, but they can combine in so many different ways. It's unmeasurable. Well, reality is a complex system. Prediction is not therefore easy at all.
Yeah, prediction is not easy, and I also understand that there may be a lot of challenges that astrology has faced over the time in history because of mistakes that astrologers made. And Ptolemy also kind of uses the same example as you said, comparing astrologers with meteorologists, because of the fuzziness in the atmosphere, which could cause a change that an astrologer might miss. But in order to not miss, there are many techniques, which again is a very different conversation from a philosophical perspective. But what I want to do now is to understand having a conversation with someone in a conference or something without having any chart or something. And you're talking about the second Saturn square and the first Uranus square coming at the same time. And what would you kind of talk to that person, or what would you say to that person?
Well, I try and honor the both. I try and say, look, so let's say they're 21. There's a series of options, aren't there? Maybe they went to university at 18. Maybe they're finishing a graduate course or in the final year of it, and they're thinking about postgraduate. Or maybe they didn't go to university and they've been in an apprenticeship, or they've been working, or maybe they've been on gap travel. You've got to honor the two different things. And what are the two different things? Whenever I'm confronted with a psychological question about a Saturn dynamic, I always go to the word maturation, and it seems particularly important here. 21 is about maturation, isn't it? American society, this is the first time a person could go to a bar and drink if they so wished, or whatever. It's about, encouraging the person's maturation. It's the second square. It's not the initial action. Their initial action to maturation started around 7, and you could say 7 to 14 is when people get into school more, they have more independence. So it's like, what is the maturation process for this young person? How can it be encouraged? How can they be taken seriously? It's really important to take young people seriously and not just talk down to them. And then at the same time, you have this individuation crisis, Uranus square. Like suddenly they're contemplating, I might actually be in the world, or I could do this, or I could do that. Oh my God. And people can collapse under the pressure of the choice. Choice isn't always good for people. It freaks them out. So supporting them in the Uranian part of it, and giving, I would, especially at that age, try to give a sense of, look, if you did choose a postgrad and you weren't enjoying it, you could always switch to a different subject or stop it. Or if you started a job and you weren't enjoying it, you could move to another. That power of change in Uranus, they're still young enough. It's not like talking to a person later on, because you have to be frank. Say it's the second Saturn return at 57, 58, 59. There's only so many bigger transformations a person's got in the bag at that point in their life. And you have to be clear about that. You're not going to help them by being this overly young, overly optimistic astrologer. Talking to some 70-year-olds, say, and going, well, you could just transform like this. No, people have only got so much of that in their life system, but not at 21. At 21, they've got enormous opportunities. So it's about tracking their maturation with them and gaps in their maturation, the Saturn square, and then tracking the individuation potential and encouraging the sense of freedom and choice, and that they don't have to get stuck in anything just yet.
Yeah. So in a sense, it's also kind of trying and creating a boundary, not just for us, but also for the other people to not step in, where we try to make our own choices and also to maintain our individuality at the same time. And at that particular age.
Yes. Yeah, lovely, but beautifully put. Well, because you realize, what astrology does, and this is where therapists, it also helps, it seems to me, because a very simple thing that astrology can do for people, where you don't even need to understand it that well. You don't need to be like an astrologer running progressions or solar arc directions or various things, is to understand these archetypal things: 21, 28, 29, 30, first Saturn return, second Saturn return, Uranus opposition, early 40s or late 30s, early 40s. That's an incredible gift in itself, to understand that there are these inbuilt initiatory structures within life, archetypal portals, in which if you understood them, I was blessed to learn astrology several years before my first Saturn return, and to have learned it to quite a high level. That really helped me.
Which is kind of a turning point in your life itself, because you started having this self-realization a lot more than before. So the point is also self-aware. So being self-aware at the age of 20 or 21 is probably the greatest gift. If I was self-aware when I was 21, things would have been much different. But on the other hand, I started dealing with a lot of crises. One is I was going through my nodal reversal, and on the other hand, there is also this, a few years later, again, we have this nodal return. So, which becomes a little bit of a tricky territory to manage. And we have to face different sets of realities and also crumbling realities.
Brilliantly put. It's a brilliant observation. So the nodes are on a sort of approximately 18-year cycle. So, just prior to 21, there's been a nodal return, and then there's a nodal opposition at 27, just prior to the Saturn return. By the way, I think that's the real kicker. I think that's the thing that makes sense of the Saturn return. The year or two before the Saturn return, you have a nodal opposition. So the transiting north node is on the south node. What are you being asked? What's the best from the past that I can bring forward? Who am I? What do I need to bring forward? What do I need to let go of? And that's the preparation for the Saturn return, which is the first huge act of maturation.
Preparation for the Saturn return. I think that's something that I really like, because the earlier cycles are not about just learning from the past or moving on, but it's also kind of preparing for the next major pivot or the turning point from one cycle to another.
Yes. it's so funny you should use the phrase turning point, right? We did a masterclass on this, exploring these cycles in Wales here 2 years ago. We called it turning points. And we
Oh,
did the
amazing.
interlocking of these cycles. You're very astute thinker about these things. I have to say, having never, I mean, people don't know, but we've literally not even had a conversation of any kind before today. I have a lot of respect for the way you've prepared this and the way you've read this material and the way you've thought about it. You are a very attentive reader, clever and sincere thinker about it. And I think lots of the ways you're thinking about astrology are truly exciting to me. And, you know, we're not, yes, I have criticism sometimes of various traditional forms of astrology because I passionately believe we have to link the symbols of astrology to the person's being. The consciousness of the individual is the anchor, not our technique. So our technique gives us a range of possibilities, and then we anchor the possibilities not through a technical analysis, but by turning from the chart to the person and asking them about their life. You don't need to work out if fourth house was mother or father, or if a particular relational signature meant the end of a relationship, or it just meant a change in its direction. You can ask them. They're the great resource, you know? So I do challenge astrology sometimes, but really I'm only just trying to make it more accessible to these real processes that you've just named, like in your own life, the crises that shape us. I'm trying to say life is an initiatory process, right? Things happen to us and we respond or we fail to respond. And that is itself a response, a problematic one. But and astrology can help us map that. And that will become an enormous psychological and even spiritual gift in time. As you mature, you realize understanding these things is part of the increasing the self-awareness you were talking about. It's not just that it happened to you. You have to contemplate back. You have to think back to it and digest it.
And that what something that you call as karmic freedom, the first step towards karmic freedom? And the first step can be anytime. So it can be at
Yes.
21 or 28 or 29 or maybe 36. But somewhere down the line, we kind of take different steps towards the future, and understanding and being aware of our past presents the stepping stone towards the karmic freedom that we may experience.
Because this understanding of the past, right, it's part of a process of metabolization. The nodes, you know, the dragon's head and tail. What's going on between the head and the tail? You know, digestion, metabolization, taking in the food that the head eats and before it excretes, processing it. Rudyard talks about this explicitly on it in his 1971 pamphlet, not quite as directly as me just there, but the point being, you don't bridge to the new and the karmically free by destroying the old. That is largely outside of certain rare, you could say, spiritual experiences. That is largely a form of immature thinking. Like, I must totally get rid of everything to have this new experience. No, that's mainly a trauma thinking, I would argue. You know, actually the new arises from your deep understanding and acceptance of the past.
Is the true karmic freedom. I know this is something which I enjoyed in your book, and that leads us to soul psychology.
Yes.
So,
Well, this is so people go to psychology, don't they? I've met a lot of people that have gone to academic psychology trainings hoping it would be like Carl Jung's Modern Man in Search of a Soul or something. But they don't get that. They get social psychological literature. They get, you know, thousands of interview questionnaires trying to identify fundamental personality traits, etc., etc. Nothing wrong with that work. But it's not answering the deep yearning to have some sort of eternal value or meaning that many people are going into psychology looking for. Only soul psychology, only a spiritually orientated psychology, you know, the best of Jungian thought, psychosynthesis that I was trained in, the Italian doctor Assagioli, the best of some of the movements in the 60s in Esalen, or you know, the work that Richard Tarnas and Stanislav Grof were doing.
Yeah.
Psychedelics and astrology or something. There are to me, there's a danger of even the highest quality modern psychology failing people because it fails to see the spiritual dimension or the psychic dimension of life.
So, and moving on, there is
Yes.
one thing, the ethical considerations as a therapeutic astrologer. Initially, we spoke about some of the lines that an astrologer need to draw for themselves, especially not dealing with uh, people who have acute personality disorders.
Yeah.
So, and so being self-aware of our own work and our own,
Yeah.
strengths or potentials is very important. So is there a way where we can draw a line where this is the kind of client that we should take and this is the kind of client that we should not take within the therapeutic circles as well? So obviously, if you are practicing evolutionary therapeutic astrology, you wouldn't take someone who wants a traditional reading. But
Well, that's
that
to do with that. So that's a pre-selection. So we have to
yeah,
distinguish between.
yes. So I'm talking about more. I want to know more about within your practice. How do you choose?
Well, so you could say, couldn't you, that there's a self-selection going on because I've written books and I have lectures and I'm on podcasts and I have a website with lots of material on it. You know, if you go to www.markjonesastrology.com, there's a blog, there's, you know, free content, there's kind of information, right? I've got something out there, so an awful lot of pre-selection is going on. Yeah.
Right.
And then if it's not, if someone writes to me and says, "Oh, do you specialize in this? I wasn't sure," and I just go, "No, but I know someone who does." I mean, I would just wholeheartedly recommend someone else. I am not trafficking for business here, you know. So that's only something that can come when you're a mature, experienced figure, by the way, because obviously when you're starting out, you really do desperately want people to work with and to build something up. And that's got to be understood. That's natural. That's not, there's nothing wrong with that, but it can lead to errors of judgment. Not working with people sometimes is the gift that you give, you know, that because they're not, because you're not the right fit, or the specialized knowledge isn't there, or, you know, or when you're doing ongoing work too. So pre-selection is the key for the individual reading, because you don't want to be turning people away from an individual reading, because even if you're not their normal kind of person, they might get something out of it that you couldn't predict effectively, you know. Certainly people who work with me ongoingly that really value therapeutic astrology will treat themselves on their birthday for a reading with another astrologer that's a different kind in order to experience something else. You know, that can still be enriching. We don't have to all fall into partisan camps. The trick becomes the selection process for any short or midterm follow-up work. That's more of a therapeutic question, and that's where the specialized mentoring, that's where people perhaps might need supervision or insights or trainings, just spotting red flags, you know, because not because no one's saying they want to do the difficult work. It's just that if a way of working with someone is genuinely not the best way to work with them, then it's not helping anyone, is it? The young practitioner will feel disappointed when it doesn't work out. You know, I've seen young astrologers or people starting out early on, just like I've seen therapists starting out early on, stop working because things were difficult or things went wrong with one person. And then you're shutting down all that potential to help all those other people.
Yeah. So I think you kind of answered my next thought as well. So, which was basically like, in some cases, we tend to find something is not working with a particular client, and there needs to be some form of strategy or an exit strategy to kind of put in place. But before that, we need to have a realization that this particular client is not necessarily our cup of tea. So I think you kind of touched upon that and answered that as well. So
remember, you don't have to work with people, right? Remember, the whole thing is a choice, right?
Yes.
You're not, and remember this more generally as an astrologer, just because you're there as an astrologer does not mean you're a psychic. You don't have to answer every question. People could go, "Oh, can you tell me when I'm going to meet my love of my life?" Or, "Can you tell me if I should move from Chicago to LA?" No, you don't have to answer those questions. You can talk about it with them, or you could recommend them to an astrolocality person about the moving question or whatever. But do not be drawn outside of your area of expertise. There is no need. There's such a projection on astrologers that they be everything. even the most brilliant professor in university, or the most brilliant consultant doctor or oncologist or something, they don't diagnose people without rigorous tests over long periods of time, right? Why are we accepting this unconscious burden that we be everything to people, that we somehow magically sort things out or have every answer? I say to you, put it down. We are not Jesus. We are not the Buddha. We are not the great prophet on the mountaintop. You know, it's important to recognize we are professionals. We are service orientated. We have used our time and intellect and creativity to learn the skills to a high level, but doesn't mean you can do everything for people. It's really important to remember it. And it's not a failure to just say, no, I don't work in that way. Or no, that's not my area of expertise. I don't want to confuse you by talking out of turn.
And that's a very good line to draw.
Yes.
And end this session as well.
Yes. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
pretty much, yeah. So what you said in the beginning kind of stuck with me, and it probably is a quote as well: healing the wounded and individualization, encouraging the people to their full potential is what the primary purpose of Soul Speaks. So I surely recommend your book, The Soul Speaks.
Thank you.
To everyone who's watching the show and understand the therapeutic potential of astrology. And I hope this just reminds one starting point, and people try to pick up from here and see what happens in their own lives and practices. So thank you so much, Mark, for joining. This has been a really amazing conversation.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure. You, sir, are a great person to talk to. You have a very inquiring, your ability to cut to the chase. I mean, frankly, you're just making me think about some of it in a dynamic way. You know, it's really nice. Really been a pleasure.
Thanks very much. So that's it for this episode, and we'll see you next time.